streaming live
at
at
www.
www. dot
New Haven Independent.
no yeah
.org.
.org.
Hello and welcome to WNHH Radio's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make the Elm City tick. There's a time bomb ticking, folks, in New Haven and worldwide. It's called climate change. And Mark Silk has been keeping an eye on climate change and working to keep our eye on it. Mark is a professor of religion and public life and director of the program on public values at Trinity College. He also organized a forum for the candidates for governor this year to talk about climate change, to get that issue in the mix. He's creating a coalition of religious leaders and climate scientists to keep the issue in the forefront, which is very much in the news here in New Haven and internationally this week. So Mark Silk, welcome to the program, and thanks for coming on.
Oh, delighted to be here, Paul.
So you recently also had a conference for journalists, right? You wanted us to do a better job in the governor's race, which really seems to be consumed with the taxes issue, to make climate change an issue. Why do you want climate change to be an issue in a governor's race, and what does the press need to do a better job of?
Well, one of the, as I don't have to tell you, federal government at this point is not interested in dealing with climate change at all. In fact,
matter of fact, they've gotten rid of scientists who document it.
They got rid of scientists. The president has said he's going to pull out of the Paris Accords. He wants to promote coal. Basically, they don't even want to pay lip service to the issue, and so if anything is going to happen, it's got to happen at the subnational level. That means state, municipalities, regional. We have to try to do things, where we can, and that includes state stuff. And incidentally, that's not a new thing. There's been state action here in this state. There have been in other states, certainly California. There have been regional compact. There's something called RGGI, which we can talk about. So it's not as if this is something that we've just sort of pulled out of the air in the last 2 years. But I think it has to be cranked up.
And what's at stake?
The future of civilization as we know it. I mean, the planet will be here, but we may not be. And I think what you alluded to earlier on Sunday, the UN released a new report suggesting really that the kind of back of the envelope number that people have been using for a long time, 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures above pre-industrial levels, is not a good number.
They're saying that by 2040, which is a much earlier time than most people had previously predicted, there are going to be cataclysmic changes in the world. leading to millions of more deaths and destruction of all sorts of communities along shorelines, at least.
That's right. And, it's not as if we aren't in a bathtub that's already full and sloshing back and forth. All we have to do is look down at the Florida Panhandle. When I lived in Atlanta for almost 10 years, worked for the newspaper there, actually.
The Constitution?
Yeah, Journal-Constitution.
When did you work there?
From 87 to 96.
Oh, wow.
Left just after the Olympics.
You were a reporter?
I was a reporter. I wrote editorials and columns, too. Did different things.
And what was your news beat?
My favorite news beat actually was covering a county courthouse, DeKalb County, but I did a range of things, including covering the 1988 presidential campaign. I covered Mike Dukakis.
Oh, wow.
So I did. It was sort of wacky. I started out my journalistic career as covering a presidential race.
And then you pivoted to academia.
Well, I'd always been interested in religion. I'd written a couple of books on religion in America. Contemporaneously, and then Trinity College, for whatever reason, decided it wanted to have a center for the study of religion in public life, and hired me to start it. I had been out in the world, and so that's where I've been for the last.
And how did
decades.
When did that pivot to you becoming an activist and trying to marshal academics and political people around the issue of climate change?
Well, this is one of these great events where your children force you to do things. My second son, Ezra, who lives in Portland, Maine, is helped create something called the Climate Mobilization. That's his full-time nonprofit operation. And at the moment, even though he's in California, where he goes about once a month, and this really gets to your question about subnational stuff. It looks like the city of Los Angeles is about to create a climate emergency department of municipal government. And he's been working to make that happen, working at a grassroots level.
Is that to get ready for superstorms, or is that to try to cut emissions and become a zero polluting?
I think it's really the full range of things. It's also to deal with Los Angeles, as people who don't live there don't always know, is a big oil drilling city. There are people who have a lot
in city limits.
Yes,
it's a sprawling city.
There are oil wells. Well, you've probably heard of the La Brea tar pits. I mean, what that tells you is there's a lot of gunk underneath Los Angeles, and so the climate justice movement, which is an important part of this whole climate sort of coalition, is extremely strong in L.A. And so he's been working, with them and with a city councilor who's made this his sort of cause to do this, and then to create a coalition among California cities. Berkeley is now involved, and a group of even San Diego maybe, to try to band together to deal with this issue. And I think.
So your son got you involved, and then
so he said, you've got to be involved, and I always, I'm at the age where you listen to your kids, and he, and he suggested at one point, there really ought to be governors need to talk about gubernatorial candidates need to talk about it, and here's a phone number, and as an old newspaper guy, I know you call one phone number and you get another phone number, and pretty soon we had over 20 of the Connecticut environmental groups from the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters, Latino groups, and so on, who all got together to sponsor this forum, and we got a bunch of the candidates.
This is when you didn't have the primaries yet. This was before the primaries.
Just before the primaries.
So you got Democrats. You got the Libertarian candidate, Rod Hortland.
Right.
I might not have saying his name right. You got Oz Griebel. I am saying his name right. The third-party candidate. You got Ned Lamont. I think you had Joe Ganim.
Yes, we did.
But you didn't have any Republicans.
No.
So the question is, why is that, and what does that mean about the potential effectiveness of the effort?
Well, what it says is that Republicans, at least once they, in the midst of a Republican primary, see no advantage to them to talking about climate change at all. You can hope that, at least in New England, an elected Republican governor would take an interest in the subject, and that's
Charlie Baker in Massachusetts.
Charlie Baker in Massachusetts has taken an interest, and he has some pretty good people working on this issue up there. So we were, I can tell you this story, but I've been involved in putting together a coalition of climate scientists and religious leaders in Massachusetts. And that really got the attention when Cardinal O'Malley, got up in front of a press conference and announced the importance of this. This got the attention of the governor.
All right. So now, when you got the attentions of the candidates for governor in Connecticut this year, what did they say? What was there anything specific? Obviously, they're going to say, it's terrible that the Earth is heating up so fast, and we're having so many more superstorms than we used to have, and people's communities are going to be wiped out.
Well,
what did you get on the ground? What did you hope they would say and commit to, and what did they say and commit to?
well, it's important, we thought to keep a focus on what's the threat to Connecticut, and what can Connecticut do? I mean, we can all jump up and down and talk about the danger to Pacific Islands, and that's important. But if you're talking about electoral politics in a given place, you've got to know what that deals with. Of course, when it comes to Connecticut, the biggest immediate threat, is to the coastline. And I think there will probably be some people who say, well, yeah, that's helping a bunch of millionaires put their houses up on stilts. That's
in
really
New Haven,
exciting.
It's not millionaires. It's blue-collar, middle-class people who have homes in Morris Cove. And some are upper middle class, some are lower. But my question always was, why are we spending money to help them rebuild or raise homes on a part of town that, according to the statistics you provided us with, by 2015, we're looking at a 20-inch rise in water levels in Long Island Sound, which means stuff's going to be wiped out. And we're going to have more and more of these violent storms that if the sea level doesn't get them wiped out, the violent storms do. Why aren't we just telling people move inland?
Well, there's the people who are telling them to move inland are the insurance companies.
I don't blame them. Why would I insure that house?
Exactly. I think the problem is, we have this.
And why should the taxpayers insure it if you knowingly? I can see if you've been there forever, it's your only asset. But why should I insure someone? And this happens in North Carolina. There, a lot of wealthy people, Florida. They just rebuild these houses, saying, "Well, I'll live here for a few years and I'll be protected by the insurance." Why should they expect us to insure that?
Look, it's not only that. If you look, the New York Times had an excellent piece, mostly focusing on Louisiana a few days ago. They spent millions of dollars to rebuild a county jail that's going to be underwater in a few years. I mean, so yeah, and that's with FEMA money. So if FEMA leaves the decisions on rebuilding to the hands of local officials, as it's traditionally done,
short-term political interest.
It's short-term political interest. We want our county jail back. We're going to rebuild right there. Then you're not going to get anywhere.
So would you want candidates to say to voters, I don't want to subsidize you from the storms. I want to help you move instead?
Well, one of the things that we have to worry about, and I'm not going to evade your question. I think, yes. I think you've got to have some political guts. Now, in a gubernatorial race, is one of the candidates going to say that? Probably not. But I think one of the...
They're going to talk about a few sinking homes and not the many more that will sink.
Well, they not only have to talk about that, but one of the things that people don't think about enough, you say, okay, so these houses on the beach are going to be in trouble. It's I-95. It's all of the sewer and water treatment. All of that stuff is right in the way of
what should we be doing
rise.
that? We have a waste treatment plant right on the cove there. What should we be doing with that, Mark?
We've got to get rid of it and build inland. I mean, look, there are nice words for what we can do. We can do mitigation strategy, which means try to act like the Dutch and build walls, which is incredibly expensive. We can have adaptation strategies, which is to say we move our infrastructure, inland. But we also have to have ways of really overall, to get to your question, there has to be some system for prioritizing what we're spending public dollars on, and to spend those dollars on protecting a few people when we have to move our entire water treatment inland is stupid. And the only way that can happen, it seems to me, is to have this surface as a public issue. as you know, as anybody who's covered state government knows, or federal government, much of what the government does is out of sight of the general public. They're not electoral issues. They're things that politicians will learn from the bureaucrats who run the agencies need to get done, and they get them done or not. One hopes that there's enough revenue to get that done. There are good people deep in the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, but that agency has been starved over the past years as the budget crisis has come in Connecticut. And it seems to me that the only way to really address this issue, which is becoming more and more immediate, is to have it surfaced as a public issue that actually gets discussed in campaigns and is not something handled simply by bureaucrats on the quiet.
And we're speaking with, on the down low, with Mark Silk, who's a professor of religion at Trinity College, who is spearheading a move in Connecticut to make sure that we're talking about climate change when we're making big decisions like who we're going to choose to run our government. He's talking about that here in Dateline, New Haven, WNHH-FM, your home for community radio, 103.5 FM, live stream at newhavenindependent.org. So, Mark, you were saying that you were giving me a heads up on some of this. You say that the biggest immediate threat from climate change in Connecticut affects low-lying coastal areas like New Haven, Stamford Bridgeport, New London, Groton, and that the immediate threat isn't permanent inundation from rising sea levels. That's coming later. But frequent and violent storms and repetitive flooding that accompanies them. And we've seen that. When Ella Grasso was mayor, she had a once-in-a-generation superstorm that crippled the state, needed emergency help, protecting lives and property. And Dan Malloy, I think, had 4 of them in his first term. And obviously something's changing. So you said one particular challenge will be the operation of wastewater treatment centers, all of which depend on gravity and operate close to sea level. But 100 years down the road, you said that we're going to see water levels rise 6 feet 7 inches in 100 years here, and shoreline flooding increasing factor of 5. So in addition to moving important resources, how else should we be looking at this problem?
Well, look, I think we have to think about it we think about it on one hand, what do we do in our state to shore up our immediate, infrastructure problems and so on. But the other is, how do we do our part on a broader scale to deal with the need to transition from reliance on fossil fuels, to green energy, to change the way we do business. And that's the big national and global question. And one of the things I think that's holding us back here is that even, let's forget about the climate change deniers, the Republicans who want to stick their heads in the sand. Just think about the people who think about these problems as something that need to be dealt with. Over the past few decades, these public policy types have shown a great preference for market-based solutions, for
give you an incentive to make it more worth your economic while to install green energy, to go
exactly. So
to become more energy efficient in your business. They cap and trade, where you trade your ability to pollute, and you get some money for it to somebody else who hasn't polluted as much.
You do that. You also increase the gas tax. You make fossil fuels more expensive so that people will switch over. These are, so the whole carbon tax idea. I think it's very problematic. For one thing, just at a political level, what you're doing is telling people, well, your gas and your oil is going to cost a lot more, and good things will result from that. That's an easy political position to fight. And it also means that if you put a carbon tax on and then somebody comes along the next year and decides to take it off, where are you? That kind of thing has happened.
Gas is cheap still.
Well, gas is cheap still.
So William Nordhaus, who's an economist at Yale, has been studying this issue since the 70s, climate economics. Mm-hmm. He won the Nobel Prize this week.
Correct.
He won it for championing the very idea you're questioning, which is market-based solutions, especially carbon tax, to climate change. And I asked him about that this week. He said he's more confident about that than ever, about its efficacy and being the best possible solution politically, because he said that you got to get a lot of nations together to do stuff to make government work slowly, try to get a solution to other kinds of attacks on climate change. But if you put the economic incentives in, people, based on his research, they really do the thing you want them to do.
I have no Nobel Prize.
Not yet.
However, my late father, who was economics columnist for the New York Times, was an economist. So I grew up.
Leonard Silk?
Yes, indeed.
Wow, that's your dad.
I grew up around economists. He believed in market solutions, but he didn't think they did everything. Let me say a couple things, but I think it's really a conversation that needs to be had at a broad level. When in the environmental area, people are used to having solutions that simply say, this is an imperative. We have to clean up Love Canal. We have to save this species. We have to do this because this is what we have to do.
And there's no substitute for getting people to commit jointly to take on a problem and acknowledge it.
So exactly. And people understand that kind of imperative. If you say, well, yeah, we're going to sustain a certain amount of health problems, but you can always move away and so on, it doesn't have the same kind of impact. So that's one thing. I think when it comes to environmental concerns, and climate change is the biggest one we face and will ever face, I think market-based solutions don't have the impact. The second thing, though, is when we're dealing with an emergency, and this is an emergency, we're talking about a 12-year window now, as little as that, before way worse things begin to happen. Think about
it. There's a 22-year window. Are we talking about 2040?
Well, 2040, but 2030 also as a near end.
2018 is not looking great.
Well, exactly. But think about a market-based solution after Pearl Harbor. The government goes to GM and says, look, we're going to put a big tax on automobiles, and we're going to pay a good deal for tanks. And we think, we're going to have a shift over because of a market-based solution from automobiles to tanks. And we think that sooner or later, we're going to get enough tanks to be able to fight the Nazis and Japanese. And we hope that'll happen. And that goes for airplanes, too. We did not do that.
So, Mark, that then addresses the next question I want to ask you. So on the ground, in addition to the big commitment you're hoping to get from state office holders, there's the immediate problem of how we're going backwards. And this is the Democrats who did this. We're going because they control the legislature still, sort of, and they head the governor's office. They've gone backwards on incentives for solar.
Correct.
Like we just got our solar system because the incentives are about to disappear. So the state has incentives for you financially to put solar in your house so you can afford to do it. And now I guess under lobbying from the electric utilities, they're going to phase out a program called net metering, which I kind of saw as a market solution, but I guess not. Tell me what net metering is, why it's going away, and why that's a problem.
This is basically the whole idea of net metering was you put solar on your roof, or you put solar on your, you install a bunch of solar panels around your house. You get the energy that it generates free, and the extra energy you sell back to the electric companies at,
I thought you don't use any of the energy. You have to, by law, give it all to electric companies. And then you get stuff back and you get a credit for what you gave them.
Okay,
which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I think that's how it works.
Well,
when we get our panels up, that's not going to be powering my toaster. I'm going to be sending that to UI, and UI is going to be sending me back the juice for the toaster.
Well, it depends on what the cost is, and I think there are different systems in different states for how that works. But the basic idea is you sell it in, you get paid for what you generate, and then you get cheap energy back because you helped generate it. And under the law that was passed in 2017, that whole system gets phased out, and the incentive for people to rooftop solaring on then disappears.
What incentive disappears? You're still not going to be able to power your house with it in Connecticut. So what's going to happen when this goes away?
You can sell it. You can put it back into the grid, and then you buy your same energy, as I understand it, from the power company.
But that's happening now under the current system.
Well,
I thought there was an extra financial incentive thrown in that's going away to install it. Well, there are two separate incentives. There's one incentive going away in a year, which is for the installation. But I thought the net metering, they're going to change the way they calculate the electricity back and forth, so that it's not an advantage to do it.
I think that is exactly right, and it gets into the weeds. And some of this has to do with the price at which, since the cost of solar has gone down, the energy companies are not happy selling you.
And they're worried they can't make enough profit, and they get a sympathetic ear with the legislature. I think, and this is beyond my expertise, but my understanding of it is they say we have a big grid to run, and public safety depends on that grid. We need to have an electric system that makes sure hospitals are running, that makes sure that we don't all go dark. But what I thought some people have looked at this issue have concluded is that we need microgrids. Because as it is, the Russians or a mistake or hackers from North Korea could shut down power plants. They can get in the computers and shut them down. And that microgrids might be the solution for energy efficiency anyway, because you lose a lot of energy when you transmit it over distance on a line, on a grid. But if you have a neighborhood that's connected, a much higher percentage of what you generate is going to go back to your home and not be lost. That'll be cheaper. It'll be more efficient. It'll be less vulnerable to attack, which is a real danger. And the other issue you have to deal with is like solar energy probably can't do 100% of your house unless you get a lot of panels and you have just the right angle with the sun. That's another reason you need the grid, so that you can go back and forth at times of need.
Look, here's what I would say, and these are the whole climate change issue is the most multidisciplinary issue that exists. Many scientific areas of expertise, from biology to geology to physics. You have a range of public policies, social scientific disciplines that are involved in developing solutions, and you have the whole humanistic views of, how do we make choices about who gets the benefits? How do we allocate? How do we care about poor people? Where are our values? So it is an immensely complex issue. It seems to me that, when we set about fighting World War II, what we put in place, and people don't like that approach these days, but nonetheless, was sacrifice and was a command and control system.
The government tells you what can be produced and
the
how much.
Government makes decisions.
And what the price will be.
What the price will be.
Even Richard Nixon had price controls in 1970.
He did. And the resistance to even beginning to think about that, when we know that the entire planet is about to be inundated, that we are losing the permafrost, that ice caps are melting, that sea level rise is happening, that ocean acidification is happening, that this whole range of things is happening, and people are not prepared, and government officials are not prepared to think about actually creating a system of public policies that is going to address it. So if you take your microgrid concern, to wait until some market, arrangement makes it in the interest of your neighborhood to set up a microgrid, and how the infrastructure for that is going to work into
I just think the states should stop trying to make it not possible.
Well, that would be good. That would be a good first step. But I think that the time is too short. And people it's easy to make fun of alarmists. The sky is falling, said Chicken Little. It's hard at some point after Katrina, we
can't remember in the last year all the names of the storms that have destroyed communities in this country.
And look at what's just happened in the Gulf. Nobody was expecting a big hurricane. By all accounts, you have superheated water in the Gulf.
Rick Scott, the governor, said biggest storm in the history of Florida, and that's saying something.
And it essentially came out of nowhere. There was not enough time for a proper evacuation of the population along the Gulf. And I know that area. It is, those kinds of storms are what exist today. Forget about 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We are now in a very full bathtub, and the water is sloshing around.
We're also on WNHH-FM, your home for community radio, where we're talking about climate change and state policy. Mark Silk, he is the professor of religion and public life at the director of program public values at Trinity College and an organizer of a statewide coalition of religious leaders and climate scientists to try to get us talking about this when we're talking about whom we elect to office. Another issue you talked about, Mark, with state policy and climate change is our ability to join other states in filing lawsuits against polluters outside the Northeast who are responsible for much of the pollution we get because of wind. And you're saying that our ability to file those lawsuits and prevail has been hampered for two reasons. One is we have a state budget crisis, so there's less money for the Attorney General's office, although the Attorney General's office is a moneymaker. They make, in some, millions and millions of dollars every year more than they spend because of settlements from class action lawsuits. So I wasn't sure why that was an issue. But the other issue you're talking about, the appeals courts, steadily has been getting more conservative appointees on appeals courts, much more favorable to businesses that get sued, much more skeptical of federal action to deal with environment. And that starting in 2008, and then an appeal in 2010, the federal judge in the Allegheny Energy case, where they said a company had not followed the Clean Air Act, the appeal was dismissed, that you're thinking the terrain is going to be much more problematic for states using the courts.
Yes, well, and we just have a new Supreme Court justice who is probably going to be less than sympathetic to lawsuits on this in this matter and to any effort. I mean, I think they just will uphold the Trump administration's scaling back of EPA regulations put in place by the Obama. And I think one of the things that happened, just to address the legal environment, is that these are complex cases where you sue energy companies to make sure that they put in place systems to scrub coal-fired power plants and so on. There's complex regulatory environment there, and in the early days of this, in the early part of this century, the judge would hear the case as a without a jury, and the decisions from the judges tended to be in favor of the states. One of the things that the power companies discovered is if they went to a jury trial, they could throw enough sand in the eyes of a jury.
It's not just the judges that are the problem now.
Yeah, well, what you have is also members of juries from states that are doing the most pollution. So if you have to sue a power company in Illinois, which is putting a lot of junk into the atmosphere, and you've got an Illinois jury, and you can appeal to the jury that this is going to mean a serious loss of jobs in their community, you got a better shot as a power company, and I think the set of issues. I mean, what looked like a good way, at least to deal with environmental pollution coming from power plants in the Midwest, is now not looking so good.
So one action that local governments and state governments have taken, including New Haven, is to sign a pledge by a certain date to become carbon emission free. So we want to be completely green, 0% carbon emissions. New Haven has started putting in fuel cells. They want to produce less waste. How realistic a goal is that? It sounds great at the press conferences. How big an impact that will make? Because there are dozens, I believe, communities in Connecticut have already signed this. Can the state government and can the city governments and town governments in our state make a real impact on helping to save the planet by that kind of pledge?
Well, it's nobody's going to can claim that if New Haven makes itself completely carbon neutral, that's going to save the planet. If you can multiply New Havens by tens of thousands of cities, that may begin to have an impact. I think it's important to begin to think in these terms.
Show the way.
To show the way and to educate people and to change mindsets.
That is the mission of Mark Silk, Professor of Religion and Public Life at Trinity College, Program in Public Values, the director, founder, and the organizer of a coalition of religious groups and climate scientists to get climate change on our agenda, public agenda. Mark, before you leave, where should people get more information and how they get involved?
Well, I think there are some great organizations in Connecticut, the League of Conservation Voters, Lori Brown. There's Adam Wood at the. There are a range of environmental groups, but I would go to the website of the Climate Mobilization. It is an organization that is working to create these municipal leagues, and it tells the truth in a way that people have to hear. So
Climate Mobilization.
The Climate Mobilization, that's my pitch. And
right.
And I do have to say, Paul, that my son is the chief strategist for it. So
right.
So with that disclaimer, but that's where I would put that's nickel.
Kosher, no problem.
Okay.
Mark Silk, thanks so much for coming on and spreading the word here on Dateline New Haven. Thanks, everyone, for listening today. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. Now, we know what it's like to be free. We just got to remember to book our flight. Fly free with us all day and all night long here in WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.